like and subscribe. Doctors of Reddit, what happened when you diagnosed a Covid-19 denier with Covid-19? Obligatory not a doctor, but I'm a nurse. We had a guy come in with what he thought was bronchitis. Asked for the test just to calm his family down. His chest x-ray showed COVID pneumonia, and his test came back positive. First it was I'm going to need to know my test results before I believe it. Then it was I need to see the test results because you can say anything. He refused admission and left and as if trying, say the most ridiculous thing he could think of, said and I wanna be telling my family because I just don't believe this. He returned 2 days later, oxygen saturation in the 70s. He spent about a week in the ICU, intubated, before dying. I know this sounds really bad, and I shouldn't say this, but I'm a piece of and will say what many people are probably thinking. Good riddance but rip. Feo who wholesomeness. Ah yes, anonymous Redditis using free meme images like heartwarming on terrible comments like mine XD. Not entirely related, but with visiting not allowed we would make more of an effort to call families to update them. I was on a non-COVID ward, and updating a family member of an elderly patient, they asked about COVID swab results. I used my best reassuring tone to let them know they'd been negative so far, and we were doing our best to keep it that way. His response was negative. Well, how about that? And he went on a rant about how it was all a hoax. Not a doctor, but an EMT. We got called for someone with difficulty breathing. Arrived on scene to find 87 EOF in tripod position. Bad sign. With visibly labored respirations. Dispatch warned us of covered symptoms, so I was in full PPE, gown, gloves, goggles, N95, and surgical mask. We assessed vitals, and found her SpO2 was in the low 80s, very bad sign, with respirations of 28 BPM and bilateral rales and wheezing, also very bad sign. As I'm getting vitals, my partner is asking her some questions, while one of the trainees goes to ask her daughter for a history. Part spends the entire time yelling at us about how it's a hoax, and tells me to take my mask off. We refuse, and I tell her I need the mask for my protection and we actually need her to put one on. She says like hell I'm putting one on, but she's too weak to fight us, so we put on her anyway. She swears she does not have COVID, even though daughter says she has a recent positive PCR. In the ambulance, she tried to pull my mask off. I warned her, if she tries that again I will restrain her. She then tries to explain to me that I'm a sheep, and killing myself as she struggles to breathe on 15 lpm of O2 via NRB. I'm an document. Had a patient a few months back refusing to wear a mask. Calmly explained to him how it is hospital policy during the pandemic, that everyone has to wear one to protect each other. He seemed to take it pretty well, even though he kept trying to say that the mask makes it impossible for him to breathe. At the same time he kept trying to tell me how he knows all the science and masks actually cannot stop the virus from transmission. He then gets super worked up, rips his mask off, and starts screaming about 2 inches from my face about how I'm stupid I was for not knowing all the facts. He literally said I can't believe that I'm hospital hires huge. I'm pussies like you to be a doctor. You need to man up, it's not that big of a deal. He then stormed off coughing. 2 things. 1. Millions of counted, and probably at least a million uncounted dead across the world to me constitutes a big deal. And even if it doesn't kill you, because you are young and healthy it can still really you up. Strokes, heart attacks, blood clots, new onset type 1 diabetes, bowel obstructions I have seen it all even in people who are super healthy and young. Get your vaccine when you are able to people. 2. You can't say that a mask makes it impossible for you to breathe, and that it doesn't stop transmission. The virus particle is like 1,000 times larger than an O2 molecule. You can't say that the mask magically blocks oxygen, but lets the much larger virus pass through. That doesn't make sense. I work in dermatology, and although not intuitive, there are many skin manifestations of COVID-19. Some manifestations are relatively specific, others not so much. I had a patient in our outpatient clinic who presented with pernio, one of the more specific skin manifestations of COVID, who flat out refused to wear a mask to her appointment, refused to allow us to administer a COVID swab, and proceeded to counsel me on how COVID was hoax. Given that we had a high suspicion of COVID, we shut down our clinic for the day, for the safety of our other patients. One of my nurses tested positive 3 days later, despite self-isolating, and we had to keep the clinic closed until all other workers had a negative results. This took 10 days. Although this was costly to my practice, what bothered me the most was the inconvenience that it placed on all the other patients I was supposed to see that week. In fact, one of the patients who had to move their appointment was subsequently diagnosed with melanoma, likely didn't change their disease course, but was still difficult to see. Edit, the nurse is healthy, she had a mild course. Also, it has been shown that patients with pernio often have a less severe course with COVID, which I'm sure only exacerbated this entire situation. Haven't seen the patient again. Edit 2, first gold, thanks. And a hug. Did not even know that existed, but that was fun. Thank you. Aiku nurse here, 6 years. Dealt with COVID since March 2020, actually had the first confirmed part at our hospital. November to February was rough. I had a 2-week streak where every day 1 or 2 of my patients would die. We'd go up to 3 or 4 patient assignments, the norm is 2:1 or 1:1F on certain equipment. Most all of the patients understood the severity of what they had. A handful didn't believe they had COVID, even though removing high flow O2 or their BiPAP would put their SATs down into the 60s or 70s. Many had comorbidities that put them at risk, COPD/asthma, obesity/sleep apnea, smoking. I think people would refuse to be intubated because they knew what the outcome would be. Fight, hope, pray, fingers crossed, whatever you want to call it. Delaying the inevitable. Our ICU attending would actually have them sign consent for intubation if they were cognizant enough to do so. Almost all of them died. Very few made it out alive, but still so sick and debilitated, some with trachea. One guy in particular sticks out. This was right after Christmas. 21 years old, HX1, obesity, sleep apnea, didn't like to take his insulin. Admitted with COVID. Didn't believe he had it. Should have been tubed days before but refused, then he ended up being intubated emergently. Took about 5 of us to prone him, lay him on his stomach, because his O2 sats were in the 60s. Couldn't get a pulse, noticed no WAV form on the yard line. Had to flip him back over to do CPR for about an hour or so, before we called it. Had a kid and a fiancé. Honestly, it was more of the families that denied their loved one had COVID. Upset, understandably, about not being able to visit. Zoom calls just don't cut it. I say this all as my parents, mom/SD and dad/SM, are all covered deniers, even when I tell them what it's like. Well, those people had other things wrong with them though. They were older, they tell me. They send me links about all the conspiracy theories COVID. I got the Moderna in December and January, still haven't told them. It's awful. The facial swelling alone from being prone is enough to give a person nightmares. Watching someone go into multi-system organ failure, needing dialysis, unable to put them back onto their back, being maximumed out on ventilator settings and that still not being enough to the point of barotrauma, and collapsing a lung, and needing a chest tube to reinflate it. Families saying do everything, even though they had coded once or twice. Hearing families on Zoom crying, praying, singing as the patient is intubated, sedated, and paralyzed so the ventilator can do the work. Tearing up under all the PPE because yeah, we are still human. We work so hard and sometimes it doesn't matter. But we go back, day after day. I wish people who don't believe could see what I have seen. It might scare them enough to take precautions seriously and get the vaccine. IQ/covered IQ charge nurse here. Had a woman try leaving the ER against medical advice with COVID and was needing tons of O2. Our docs convinced her to get admitted. My wife was her nurse and brought her up to me. Patient was yelling and screaming, ripping off her mask, spitting and telling us when are all sheep between gasping for breath. Our docs told her she was close to needing to be intubated, breathing tube, and she just scoffed. We reached out to the husband who proceeded to swear and berate us, telling us we're keeping her prisoner, no visitors in our covered unit, and that we can do whatever we need, because none of this is real and it is all for show, so you guys can get paid. She gets intubated, decompensates over the next few days, and finally codes. We code, perform CPR, give medications, defibrillate, etc. Her for well over 1.5 hours before calling her time of death. The kicker was calling her husband and getting absolutely excoriated because we injected her with COVID as an experiment and killed her. He then had to be escorted out of the hospital when he came in to try getting up to the unit without a mask, of course. This is getting exhausting. So Covid-19 no it real, but you injected her with COVID. Come on. These people are grown adults. One story stands out. Last summer a guy came to the ED with symptoms and tested positive. He refused admission for the classic list of reasons. It's a complete hoax, and even if it's not a complete hoax it's not that big a deal. I'm strong enough, etc. Couple days later he was back in the ED with his mom, who he lived with, and who was now also symptomatic. They were both admitted, and eventually put on ventilators. Guy lived, but his mom didn't. Dude killed his mom. I can't imagine how you lived with that. A doctor here. I diagnose people with COVID on the daily. Some people are actually really great about it, others are more difficult. I'll tell you a tale that occurred during my most recent shift. Back-to-back rooms and patients. Patient A, in room #4, is a 23-year male, no medical history, comes in with body aches, malaise, and fatigue. Also had some mild nausea without abdominal pain or vomiting. Patient B, in room #5, is a 51-year female, medical history of intermittent asthma, so she uses a puffer infrequently, comes in with shortness of breath, has some possible fevers at home. In Trigid was noted that this patient's oxygen sats were in the 88 range and her heart rate wasn't elevated. Interestingly, when asked if she thought she had COVID she said I can't have it, I tested negative 2 weeks ago when my son tested positive. He's been sick at home. You guessed it. Both people COVID plus. Patient A went home. He's doing great. Was extremely remorseful, and before he'd even left the ED he called his work to let them know he was positive and to get everyone there tested, because he figured he had gotten the illness at work. He worked in a small family-owned warehouse as a foreman. He also called his parents and they were getting him set up to sleep in the garage until his quarantine was up. I respected this guy. Patient B got admitted to the hospital because her O2 sats weren't great. When I went back to tell her she was COVID plus she called me a liar and told me I must have made a mistake. She threatened to sign out AMA against medical advice, but when she got up to leave she got so short of breath the nurse used that to convince her to stay. People are strange sometimes. I try not to let stuff bother me, but covered deniers come very close to crossing that line. You've been visited by the ghost of a very important man. Pay your respects by liking and subscribing, and he'll grant you 3 weeks of good luck.